Phoenix Group is the UK's largest long-term savings and retirement business. We have assets under administration totaling something like 0.3 trillion pounds. We've got around 12 million customers. And although lots of people haven't heard of Phoenix Group, they will have heard of our various brands, and most notably Standard Life. I'm head of climate change and nature. I sit in our central sustainability team. We are, as a team, responsible for setting the group's overall strategy for all things climate change and nature related, and broader sustainability, in fact. And we also oversee a lot of the reporting that we undertake, including developing the net zero transition plan that we published earlier this year. And we also do a lot of thought leadership and a lot of engagement with stakeholders and industry groups and that kind of thing. So the main trigger for developing the net zero transition plan was the fact that we'd already set a net zero target, net zero by 2050, and fairly stretching interim targets for 2025 and 2030. And although clearly a lot of thinking had gone into setting those targets, the number one driver for publishing the transition plan was ensuring that we had a really credible, robust plan to deliver those targets. And that was a plan that really aligned very fully with the organisation's wider business objectives. So that was the main driver. In addition to that, there was clearly a growing expectation from multiple stakeholders, whether that was investors, employees, many of the other stakeholders that we engage with, that we would be developing a transition plan at some point in time, and also a sense that this would at some point very likely become a regulatory requirement in future, and we would wanted to sort of develop it on the front foot rather than reacting off the back foot. So delivering net zero and tackling climate change is a big strategic priority for Phoenix Group corporately. And so when it comes to developing the plans for how we're actually going to get there, again, it's a topic that is absolutely befitting of a lot of board attention. In our case, arguably the really crucial engagement with the board actually happened a couple of years earlier, before we developed the transition plan, when we committed to net zero in the first place and set those interim targets. And there was a whole process and a journey leading up to that of getting the board totally on board with it. But that said, board engagement through developing the transition plan was also absolutely crucial, and probably from our perspective the most fundamental and the really kind of key thing that we discussed with the board was towards the start of the process, and then it became a recurring theme, which was just the real fundamental question of how did we want to set out our stall in terms of ambition and transparency, because you've already seen, I think, from the transition plans that people have already published in our sector and more broadly, quite a range in terms of how people approach it. And so we wanted to get that question, or the answer to that question, really clear with our board right from the beginning of the process. And in our case, our board is hugely supportive of our commitments to net zero. They're very bullish in that sense, and so they encouraged us to reflect that sense of ambition in our plan. So I think we were lucky in terms of our starting point, in that our board takes our purpose incredibly seriously. We're a purpose-driven organisation and is very supportive of our broader sustainability strategy. So in that context, the board was already brought into the idea of what we were trying to achieve, our net zero targets, which we'd signed up to a couple of years previously, and very supportive also of the rationale behind developing a transition plan. So I'm conscious that we did just have we were dealt a good hand to begin with. But probably a couple of points worth highlighting that sort of helped us to build on that starting point. So the first thing that's really helped reinforce that board buy-in was conducting double materiality reviews, which is something we do from time to time to determine the top priorities in our sustainability strategy, based on both the potential financial impact on Phoenix Group of sustainability related issues and the potential impact of Phoenix Group on wider society. And so we conduct double materiality reviews on a relatively frequent basis, and climate change regularly tops the list. And so we share all of that with the board. They go on that journey with us, and that just hammers home and reinforces on an ongoing basis the fact that climate change is such a strategic priority. And then the other thing it's worth, I think, highlighting is that arguably the real clincher for the board was the fact that we placed our customers at the heart of our thinking when developing the transition plan, and ensuring that all the actions that we're taking to decarbonise, everything we talk about in the transition plan and that we'll consider down the line, all of those things are fully aligned with our customers' financial interests. And when you consider the overall role of the board, and the purpose of Phoenix Group as a provider of long-term savings and pension solutions to our customers, that's clearly absolutely crucial. And so being able to demonstrate that complete alignment was invaluable with our board. So we faced all sorts of challenges and queries from the board. They were all constructive. They were all part of that ongoing dialogue, which was a really important part of the process of developing the transition plan. So some examples of the kinds of conversations that we had with the board include, just going back to the sort of one of the reasons that the board is so bought into the concept of both what we're trying to do, delivering net zero, and also with publishing a transition plan, is really ensuring that all of the things that we set out in the transition plan in terms of the specific levers that we're going to pull, the activities that we've committed to, are genuinely in our customers' best interests. That was a recurring theme, and quite understandably, and I think really helped to ensure that we were really clear on the fact that our actions fully aligned with our customers' interests. Similarly, there were lots of questions about are we setting the right pace here? Are we going up either too fast, and should we sort of take our foot off the gas a little bit? Or equally, there were challenges at times about, are we going fast enough? Should we be trying to get ahead of the game here? We've set a net zero aspiration by 2050. There are other people in other sectors who've set aspirations for 2040 or sooner, and we were very clear on the answer to that one, which is that we need to transition both in line with the science and in line with the real economy as a whole, because of the nature of our business. That brings me on to another conversation that was had with the board on at least one occasion, was the question of what is the right way to deliver net zero. We were again very clear on this from the outset, and it's very much in line with TPT and GFANZ and other guidance, which is that we want our transition to net zero to contribute to real economy decarbonisation and a broader transition to net zero. This is definitely not a paper decarbonisation exercise for us, but that was a conversation that we had with the board. And then linked to that, you can't deliver net zero as an institutional investor, a universal asset owner like Phoenix Group. You can't deliver net zero on the basis that you're driving real economy decarbonisation and maintaining fiduciary duty to your customers unless lots of other people take action. And so we had a lot of conversations with the board about how we reflected that dependency on action from others in the transition plan. The key thing that we've observed in terms of how the board engages with climate change and net zero and our transition plan is that whereas, perhaps in the early days when we very first started talking about this, and it was a relatively new topic to the board, some of the board members and some of the conversations we had might have been almost coming from the perspective of, it's nice to talk about climate change for a change, it's an interesting topic, to now seeing it as really central to the business and central to our strategy and what we're trying to deliver. And the other big change, and I think the transition plan was instrumental in this, is that as we have moved from setting targets towards taking tangible action, and in particular when that action is around taking steps to decarbonise our investment portfolio and reduce our financed emissions, scrutiny at all levels of the organisation, including the board, but actually all the way through the organisation, has definitely ramped up, as you'd expect, because relatively speaking, it's actually quite easy to set a target, and it's much harder to deliver that target. And so taking those decisions to actually start pulling those levers to implement the changes that are going to get us there, that's when the rubber hits the road. And so the engagement and the scrutiny totally expectedly has ramped up as a result. So I think the key thing that we learned through the process, which would have been, in many ways good to have really had a bigger appreciation of ahead of embarking on the process, was a fairly obvious point, but it's the fact that net zero cuts across absolutely everything we do. And so that means there are so many stakeholders who it's relevant to across the organisation. And many of those stakeholders come at net zero from slightly different perspectives. And that means that securing internal alignment across all of those stakeholders is both absolutely crucial and quite challenging, just because of the nature of how many people were involved and those different perspectives. So looking at the positive for that, the net zero transition plan was a really excellent forcing mechanism to really sharpen our internal thinking. But the learning is that that just takes time. So I think probably the biggest challenge, which was to some extent unexpected, was the fact that we needed to work with so many different stakeholders from across the organization and to get alignment across those stakeholders. And of course, depending on where you sit in the organization, what your role is, you're going to have a slightly different perspective on net zero. And that will mean that you have a slightly different perspective on what a net zero transition plan should say, how it should look, and so on. And so the time it took to do that process justice, to get to the point where we had a really robust net zero transition plan that we were proud of and felt reflected accurately what we wanted to say and ticked all the boxes for all those different stakeholders involved, was, I think, not a completely unexpected challenge, but it was an activity that probably took longer than we would have originally envisaged. So, the really obvious, tangible benefit of going through this process is that we published a transition plan. And in our case, that's a document that we're really proud of. It's landed well with our stakeholders, and I think it really sets our stall out very well. But the other benefit, which was a really genuinely very big benefit for us, and which is much less obvious, certainly externally, was just simply going through the process. And in our case, we'd set our net zero target and our interim targets a couple of years previously. We'd done lots of thinking about how we were going to deliver those targets already. But the process of going through the developing a transition plan, knowing that we were going to publish something at the end and having that guidance from the TPT and others to follow, was super, super helpful in really, really sharpening our thinking and ensuring that any of those slightly knotty questions or tensions that we hadn't necessarily completely got to in our thinking yet were properly addressed. And that we did that in a way that really brought all of the different stakeholders from across the organisation along on that journey and got them on board with us. So at the end of that process, not only did we publish this transition plan document that we're really proud of and that we think sets our stall out really well, but we also, I think, had much, much more internal alignment by going through the process.